From the New York Times, I'm Rachel Abrams. This is The Daily.
President Trump says he's going to announce so-called reciprocal tariffs on every country with duties placed on the U.S.
With less than a month in office,
we're just hours into a new trade conflict.
President Trump has pursued more trade actions against adversaries and allies than all the trade measures he took in his entire first term.
After tariffs ordered by President Trump went into effect at midnight.
Canada and Mexico will be among the hardest hit by these tariffs.
These tariffs more than triple what was done during the first term.
And there's one man guiding it all.
President-elect Trump choosing Peter Navarro for a top economic position in his next administration.
Today, my colleague Anna Swanson on how Peter Navarro rose to become one of Trump's key advisors and why he thinks tariffs will usher in a new era of American prosperity. It's Tuesday, February 18th. Hi, Anna.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Thank you for being here. I wanted to talk to you because you covered President Trump in his first term, and you focused a ton on international trade. So I figured you would be the right person to talk to and help me understand this key advisor, Peter Navarro, who's been advising Trump on all of these tariff policies that we've been hearing about recently.
Right. So I met Peter Navarro when I was covering trade policy in Trump's first term. And he's an interesting person because he had a very unusual journey to the White House. And he had views about trade in China that were considered pretty unconventional and unpopular. But over time, these views have become one of the driving forces of Trump's trade policy.
So I'm pleased to see you after 4 long years of exile.
So recently I went to see him again with 2 colleagues from The Daily.
Listeners, and I actually listened to The Daily. I had it on my podcast.
We met him at the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, which is just west of the White House.
We're going to turn to the right here. All right, here we go.
And we sat down with him in his office to understand how he came to have these ideas about trade and tariffs.
Okay. So you want us here?
Yeah. Okay. And now that he's in the role that he's in, what his ideas could mean for the country.
So, Dr. Navarro, you are synonymous with Donald Trump and his agenda, but not all that long ago, you were a Democrat. So tell us that story. Where does that story start?
I went from being kind of a Democrat to being a Trump Republican, and the reality is that there's not much difference between that. The traditional Democratic Party was a lot like MAGA in that it was the party of the working class, American manufacturing, blue-collar workers. The goal of that party, at least what it said it was to increase the real wages and prosperity of blue-collar workers. And I was very comfortable with that. I grew up in a single-family household with my mom. We had a hard life, and I identify to this day with the working class.
So when you started talking, what did you learn?
So he talked about being raised by a single mom, how he was a latchkey kid. He also loved school, and he did well, and he goes on to Tufts University. And after he graduated in the 1970s, he's thinking he wants to see what the world is like and travel a little bit.
I became really intrigued by Thailand. And one day, as I was thinking that maybe I should go there.
And then one day, kind of randomly, he's walking around the Berkeley campus, and this guy asks him, hey, want to go to Thailand?
And I looked over, and it was the Peace Corps table.
And that guy happened to be recruiting for the Peace Corps.
Of course, I had to say yes because of the synchronicity of the whole thing. I don't want to get too Californian on you, but that was an interesting moment.
And so Navarro decides to go.
Peace Corps, I feel like that's a really unusual stop along your way to becoming tariff czar.
Yeah, he says he wanted to learn about different cultures and got to travel a lot around Asia.
I mean, the whole ability to see the world from outside the United States, it makes you very humble. And when I came back, it motivated me to go into policy.
And when he came back, he ended up at Harvard studying government and economics in the 80s. He finished his PhD. He moves out to Southern California, and he starts teaching economics and public policy at UC Irvine. And then he decides to run for mayor of San Diego.
My only goal as mayor was to address the problems of traffic congestions, the overcrowded schools, the awful sewage system. I mean, it was a populist campaign, just at the local level on a different set of issues. I mean, I sometimes joke I was like mini Trump before Trump, because
he loses that election. And over the next several years, a couple of huge economic policy shifts happen that really shape his thinking. First, in 1994, comes NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And this is a really important moment for the U.S. economy because this was the first time that the U.S. was engaging in a free trade agreement with a developing country, Mexico. And then in 2001, China enters the World Trade Organization, this other big moment in trade that really shifts the politics of trade in America.
So it sounds like you have these two big moments where America is really becoming much more globalized in its manufacturing processes. You've got NAFTA, where it's signing agreements with places like Mexico and opening itself up to other countries. And then you've got this moment when China joins the World Trade Organization, which really brings China onto the world main stage in a way that it hadn't been before.
That's right. And it's after these big policy shifts when Navarro starts to see something happening with his students that bothers him.
I was the macroeconomist teaching business students how to forecast the economy. And in about 2002 and 2003, I began to notice that the business students who were in the fully employed program were losing their jobs. And it was like, what's going on here?
He's trying to figure out what's going on, and he lands on something that he calls the China price.
And what's that?
So he's observing this strange ability for Chinese firms to offer prices that are so much lower than other competitors.
50% lower prices in everything.
And he's saying that is starting to put U.S. manufacturers out of business. So he does a study to try to understand just how they're getting their prices so low.
It wasn't simply low wages.
So one way companies could get their prices low is by paying their workers lower wages. But Navarro finds that China is doing a lot more than that.
Stuff like currency manipulation, like counterfeiting and piracy, the use of pollution havens, and things like that.
And he's so troubled by this that he ends up writing 3 books on China. The first was called The Coming China Wars.
It just got skewered in the Financial Times.
That book gets panned.
Do you remember anything from the skewering? any
quotes?
It's
just, it's just radical, crazy guy, this kind of thing, right? And I thought, look, these people don't get it, except among all of the corporations and unions and plain old folk that were getting just hammered by that. It's like, okay, let's keep going on this. And I'm thinking, you know what? People read books, but not a lot of them anymore, so let's do the movie.
And then he also creates a documentary, which is narrated by Martin Sheen.
And it was the same kind of reaction, Hollywood, and it's like, oh, you're exaggerating stuff.
Anna, how would you characterize Navarro's view of all of this? Is his assessment of what China is doing fair?
He's right that a lot of people agree now that the Chinese government was not playing by international trade rules. But even if they were, I think the entry of basically 1 billion people into the global economy would have been a huge shock either way. And it ends up being kind of complicated in terms of who benefited and who lost.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Tell me what some of the benefits are first.
So The first benefit is that you do have a lot of Chinese people lifted out of poverty. So hundreds of millions of Chinese people who are moving out of poverty into the middle class. And then you have basically the American standard of living today created. You know, how many people do you know that who love Costco, who love to buy inexpensive things off of Amazon? A lot of that is made possible by this China price, by Chinese factories making cheap goods. But there were definitely a lot of downsides as well. So you have a lot of U.S. factories going out of business because they can no longer compete with the cheap prices that Chinese firms are offering. Mm-hmm. And you have millions of U.S. manufacturing jobs that were destroyed in that process, economists have found. And I don't think they anticipated just how hard the people on the losing end would be hit. There was this assumption that people who lost their jobs to trade could be helped to move to find other jobs or go through retraining programs that would give them, you know, even better jobs in this new economy. And they didn't anticipate, I think, that this transition was a lot more disruptive and painful. And the pain was really localized and vivid and sharp, particularly in the industrial Northeast and Midwest, where people now are really hurting because they don't have factory employment anymore. And economists have found that then other problems follow, like drug addiction. And these are all things that Peter Navarro is focused on, too, actually.
When I did my Death by China movie, I went to Dayton. I saw the people who would otherwise be in factories walking around with shopping carts, stealing copper out of homes and buildings, whatever they could, and then going and using the money to get high.
It really does sound like Peter Navarro is ringing the alarm bell on China kind of well before a lot of other people are. How does he actually get attached to Donald Trump, though?
So Trump at this point has been complaining about China and its trade practices for a really long time.
President Trump, the way we intersected was through an interview, interestingly enough, that he did for the Los Angeles Times in 2011.
At one point, Trump is asked by the LA Times, what are some of your favorite books on China?
And he proceeded to do something I'm not sure I could even do. He listed his top 10 books by title and author. And I was number 6, The Coming China Wars.
And he mentions one of Peter Navarro's books. So they start corresponding, and
one thing led to another. And
ultimately, then candidate Trump decides to bring Navarro onto his campaign.
What I try to do is see problems and solve them. And the problem I saw crystal clear is the unfair trade that was driving up these large trade deficits and shutting down our factories and creating just all sorts of misery for blue-collar workers.
Trump wins the presidency, and Navarro is given a job in the administration working on trade policy. But he's still kind of an outsider. There are a lot of other more influential advisors in the administration at that point who are opposed to the idea of imposing broad tariffs on foreign products. And so you come to a point where, you know, most of the other advisors are saying to President Trump, we can't do that. You know, we shouldn't impose tariffs.
It was always the same, like Mnuchin and Cohn and Kudlow and all these people. They just didn't buy in. And the defining moment for me in terms of when I finally was able to begin doing what the president wanted me to do was about 4 months in, and he made the famous "Where's my Peter" call. It's like he's sitting around with these guys 4 months in, nothing's happening at all, and he goes, "Where's my Peter?" And I go over there, and I have this like battle with Cohn and whatever, and then some months later, I'm able with Wilbur Ross to get the steel and aluminum tariffs in, and Cohn leaves like a crying little baby in a huff.
And Navarro prevails, and he helps to draft tariffs on China and on steel and aluminum from countries around the world.
So when Trump and Navarro leave office in 2021. What exactly had they accomplished in terms of the trade relationship with China?
So they had really changed the American terms of trade with the rest of the world. They had imposed a lot of tariffs on things like metals and washing machines and over $300 billion of products coming in from China. And they had also signed a trade deal with China and reworked the North American Free Trade Agreement into a new deal. But then there's an interesting wrinkle to this story. So Trump's orbit has changed a lot through the whole first term. New advisors have come in, they get fired, people are in and out very quickly. But Peter Navarro, even though he's sometimes sidelined, is there the whole time. And when the January 6th hearing comes, Navarro is called to testify, and he shows his loyalty to Trump by refusing to hand over his notes. And then he is sent to prison for 4 months for failing to honor the subpoena.
So just to clarify, I went to prison not because I didn't want to cooperate with an investigation, but because it was my duty as a senior White House official to refuse to appear when issued an unlawful congressional subpoena. That case is being litigated. It was unfortunate they put me in prison until they should have waited until my appeal ran its course. But I want to be really clear about why I went to prison. I was defending the Constitution. Now, to your point,
And he gets out of prison on the day of the Republican National Convention, and he flies directly from prison to the RNC to give a speech.
Yes, indeed. This morning I did walk out of a federal prison in Miami. Joe Biden and his Department of Injustice put me there.
Wow, that is quite an image. And we know what happens next. Trump, who is somebody who obviously prizes loyalty very much, wins the election, returns to office, and he brings Peter Navarro back with him.
That's right. And this time he is even more empowered to totally transform America's trade relationships.
We'll be right back.
So from the review of my book, there's been a steady evolution of thought amongst the public, even on Wall Street, about what I've been saying, what the president has been saying, what others in our camp have been saying. And I guess I'm mainstream now. That's scary.
So, Anna, now that we understand how Peter Navarro formed his worldview about trade with China, let's talk about his tools for bringing back manufacturing jobs to the U.S. And those tools are tariffs. Tell us about how Navarro makes the case for tariffs.
So Peter Navarro believes that tariffs are a very important tool to balance out America's trading relationships. That, as we talked about, countries like China have been cheating international rules by making products more cheaply than they should and stealing intellectual property. Mm-hmm. And basically, they're putting out goods that American businesses just can't compete with. And so American businesses need kind of a shield from those products, and that shield is tariffs.
How exactly is it a shield?
Well, a tariff is a charge on a good when it comes over the border. So if companies are making their products outside the United States and they want to sell them inside the United States, they pay that extra fee. So the thinking is tariffs will incentivize companies to make their products inside the United States so they don't have to pay that fee.
But what does Navarro say about the criticisms that are often cited of using tariffs? Like, Trump himself has acknowledged on social media that tariffs could lead to higher prices, for example, for consumers. And in the U.S., just to point out, we just went through a period of super high inflation, and that was really, really painful for people.
So I asked him about that, and he was pretty clear about his position.
Tariffs do not cause inflation when they're imposed by the largest market in the world. And that has been demonstrated by the fact that we aggressively imposed tariffs during the first term. We had zero inflation as a result.
He said that tariffs will not hurt consumers.
So I did want to push back on some of the economics of tariffs and also get your response. So, first, there were quite a few studies that showed that American consumers did bear the brunt of the China tariffs, that much of that cost was passed through. But then secondly, even more basically,
Stay with that. Okay, let's do this.
Okay.
So who are the studies by?
A lot of very prominent economists. New York Fed, but other academic economists as well.
Okay. All the ones that were wrong about Trump, like the
ones
biggest
that you don't believe in and that you kind of felt.
But I think it's fair, Anna, for you to go back and look at those analyses, who said it, and then look what they said, for example, when Trump came into office and how they predicted there would be chaos, recession, inflation, stagnation. That has never happened. I think my point here is that the academic community can't be trusted to critique Trump economics. And they have a credibility problem because they've been crying this wolf. They did it all through the first term. None of that happened. They're just wrong. We're right, they're wrong. End of story.
And you feel that the American people are on your side with that assessment that economists don't know what they're talking about?
It's the American people who've borne the brunt of this for going on, 40 years now. How many times do you have to be told by politicians and corporate flacks that this free trade stuff's good for you, and then you lose your job and your community falls down around you, for you to stop believing them? I mean, it did, that's why Trump got elected in 2016.
Setting economists and think tanks aside, even sort of common sense, right? So tariffs work by raising the price of foreign goods. And when the price of foreign goods go up, that is what encourages people to buy domestic goods. Isn't that the way that tariffs work?
All right, let's walk through that. Okay, there's a rhyme to the reason why we did.
I asked him this question a couple of times. Aren't tariffs supposed to increase prices? Because that's how tariffs work. They make the foreign good more expensive, so people buy American goods instead. But Navarro didn't really give me a direct answer.
Here's the thing. We are the biggest market in the world, which gives us buying power, okay? So particularly export-dependent economies, the Chinas of this world, who heavily rely on Americans buying their products, if that becomes more difficult to do, what's the first thing these countries are going to do in response to tariffs? What are they going to do? We slap a tariff on. What are the producers over there going to do? What are they going to do? Tell me.
What'd
they do? You're a producer over there, and suddenly, tariffs are up, and you got to compete with an American producer. What are you going to do?
So your assumption is that they would lower their prices?
That's exactly what they do. It's not an assumption. That's just a fact.
Instead, he talked about how Chinese companies would absorb some of the cost of the tariffs to keep prices low.
Your goal is to help U.S. factories, but a lot of U.S. factories do buy components and parts from abroad. And I've talked to a lot of manufacturers who say that would raise their costs. It would make them harder for them to make things. Does that kind of backfire on your agenda?
So here's one of the iron laws of manufacturing. If manufacturing goes abroad, the supply chains follow, and vice versa. Okay? So
I also asked him about U.S. manufacturers who are buying parts from abroad and whether tariffs would hurt their business. And he didn't seem all that concerned with what I've been hearing from some American manufacturers. He just kept coming back to the idea that ultimately tariffs will incentivize both American and foreign companies to build factories in the U.S.
You can have a domestic investment come quickly. When we did the steel,
which he believes will then lead to higher wages for Americans.
You see wages go up, and that gives consumers more spending power and offsets any rise in prices. If real wages rise faster than any other types of inflation, people are still better off.
And he said these tariffs aren't happening in a vacuum.
When I was a campaign advisor in 2016, I had a mantra, right? It was tax cuts, deregulation, strategic energy dominance, fair trade. Those were the four components, the tires on the car towards economic prosperity.
He argues that if the Trump administration is able to get the price of oil down, if Elon Musk and his team are able to cut government waste and red tape, and if Trump keeps taxes low, all of these moves together would reduce inflation and help the U.S. economy.
Because one of the most important things that we're trying to accomplish, that President Trump is trying to accomplish, is more stable and resilient supply chains, which we have learned to be an enormous problem in the wake of the pandemic. So that's a major national security and economic security risk.
But what Navarro said is the most important part of all of this, why he's so focused on tariffs and bringing manufacturing back to the United States, is that it all comes back to national security.
We get screwed by everyone, and we could afford it in the 1950s. We can't afford it. And that's the thing the rest of the world needs to understand. It's like when they want to come to Uncle Sam for support for democracy, if we don't have a manufacturing and a defense industrial base, because it all got exported because people are cheating us on trade, we're not going to be there. And that's why in the first term, when President Trump said economic security is national security, it was a very important message and foundation for the way we here in Trump land think about things.
The sense I'm getting from talking to you about your conversation with Navarro is that we're talking about these really aggressive, audacious policy tools. And in fact, in some form or fashion, the U.S. has been using them for the past few years. They obviously started in the first Trump administration. But what's coming through is that it doesn't sound like Navarro is actually grappling with what you're describing as the potential negative consequences of these tariffs.
I don't think that he believes in those negative consequences, no. He doesn't believe in what most experts are saying, which is that all of these tariffs could end up really hurting Americans.
It's not going to be painful for America. It's going to be a beautiful thing. President Donald John Trump has proven that tariffs work for the American people. And they're going to be even more, much more important this second term. This is all set in motion now, Anna. So stay tuned.
So that order will... he and the president are embarking on imposing tariffs at just a vastly bigger scale than we've seen in this country in many decades. And so it is kind of like a grand experiment, really, to see if they're right about how tariffs will play out for the American economy.
Well, Anna, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be right back. Here's what else you need to know today. 4 top New York City officials are resigning after the Justice Department moved to dismiss the corruption case against Mayor Eric Adams. The 4 officials oversee much of the city government, and their departure could further weaken Adams, who's resisting calls to resign. Adams was indicted on federal bribery and fraud charges, which the DOJ sought to dismiss, arguing that the prosecution was politically motivated and was impeding Adams's ability to cooperate with President Trump's deportation agenda. And on Monday, a Delta Airlines flight carrying 80 people crashed, flipped over, and injured at least 18 people on board while it was trying to land in Toronto. The accident comes after a series of plane crashes over the last few weeks have stoked fears in passengers and raised broader concerns about aviation safety. Today's episode was produced by Mary Wilson and Michael Simon Johnson. It was edited by Lisa Chow and Larissa Anderson. Fact-checked by Susan Lee. Contains original music by Pat McCusker, Diane Wong, Marian Lozano, and Dan Powell, and was engineered by Chris Wood. Our theme music is by Jim Brunberg and Ben Landsberg of Wonderly. That's it for The Daily. I'm Rachel Abrams. See you tomorrow.